He's published on a wide range of topics, literature, plays, history, politics, sociology, economics, and so on. And I think more important than being an intellectual, he's a public intellectual. In other words, he's one of those people who's put his head above the parapet and thrown his tuppence halfpenny into the national debate on the national crisis. And we do need more of that, to counter the constant sort of mantras of the conventional wisdom of the politicians and the bankers and the economists and all the bad news. There's more today and yesterday. I'm sure you're only too familiar with it yourselves. And thirdly, I'm delighted to welcome Fintan because he's synonymous with Dublin 4. And we need a lot more dialogue between Dublin 4 and BT 48. With BT 47 as well, but I think that's kind of taken for granted. And the importance of Southerners and Northern nationalists talking to each other, I think, is inclined to be overlooked. And I think, had there been a better understanding between the two in the 1960s, the Troubles wouldn't have happened. The same problems would have existed, but they would have been approached in a different way. And we might not have ended up with the Belfast Agreement, which to my mind is much too partitionist a deal. But Northerners are fond of decrying the 26 county mentality, which is undoubtedly there. But there is also a mirror image in the North among those of you who think that the leader of the Labour Party is Ed Miliband rather than Eamon Gilmore. I'll give you just one example of this because it's one of my favourites. But I was driving a girl from a student from Dublin to Derry. Now, this student could have come from anywhere in Northern Ireland. It just so happens that she came from Strabane. That's a pure coincidence. But we passed a set of roadworks in County Meath, and then another set of roadworks, and another set of roadworks. And eventually she turned to me and she said, "My God, Donegal County Council is very busy today." So I hope at the end of Fintan's talk, he's going to talk about the current crisis in Ireland and perhaps beyond, and the need for a new republic and what republicanism means genuinely. I hope you'll all have a better appreciation of the difference between Donegal and Meath. After the talk, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. But now I'll ask you to welcome Fintan O'Toole.
Thanks very much indeed for that introduction. My only caveat is I've never lived or worked in Dublin 4. Thank you very much to the Committee of Féile for the invitation, which is a huge honour, and I'm very conscious of it. And particularly thank you very much for coming out. I know I would find better ways of spending my Saturday evening than coming to listen to somebody like me, not least because Dublin are playing Tyrone and Croke Park this evening. And if anybody gets any word on the score, I would be grateful. You can interrupt me at any point. But I'm particularly grateful, I think, for Emmett's point about partitionism and partitionist mentalities, and about the opportunity to try to talk about some of the fundamental issues that obviously concern me very much, writing in the South all the time, and trying to look at them in a broader perspective of the island and beyond, I think might be quite useful. I was reading in a newspaper today. There was mention of somebody had been in Russia, and an old current Russian joke, which is that Russia is full of optimists because all the pessimists have already left, and sometimes one feels pretty similarly about Ireland at the moment. But I'm nevertheless going to try to be somewhat optimistic. Optimistic in the face of really pretty miserable conditions, and an optimism, I hope, tempered by a sense of outrage about what's currently going on. I think most of us, North and South, and from whatever political perspective we come at things from, are conscious that we're facing into a decade of commemorations. we begin with 1912 and the Ulster Covenant, the Dublin lockout of 1913, which is a crucial moment in the foundation of the labour movement in Ireland. The First World War, of course, which has a still perhaps a very shaping effect on all of Western culture and certainly on Irish culture. Into, of course, the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence, partition, and everything that follows. So for the next decade, pretty much, every year we have the opportunity to engage in commemoration. And it strikes me certainly at the moment, looking at it from the southern perspective, that it wouldn't be any harm to sort of cancel some of these commemorations in advance. I think particularly 1916 is going to be an enormous embarrassment. The idea of celebrating the idea of Irish independence, the idea of marking the notion, whatever you think about 1916, the notion that Ireland could function as an independent country. If current circumstances prevail, that's going to be an occasion for enormous national embarrassment. And in order to be in a position, I think, to connect ourselves at all with some of the energies of early 20th century Ireland, when people from different perspectives were actually very serious about the notion of something new, of some new possibility, of the possibility of an independent, decent and civilised society emerging on this island, we're going to have to change very radically the course that we're on. Oddly enough, one of the anniversaries people don't talk about is the one that for me is important, most important. And it's the assembly of the first Dáil in Dublin in January 1919. Again, whatever perspective you take on this, there's no question but that imperfect as it was, and it certainly was not entirely inclusive by any means, but the fact that there was an election and that there was a decision made by a majority of those elected not to sit in the parliament to which they were elected, but actually found a new democratic parliament, I think is one of the great acts of democratic engagement that's ever happened on this island. It was a way of making a very profound statement about political identity, which was non-violent, which was actually about engaging in a political process. And I don't wish to romanticise that process at all, or to suggest it was entirely heroic. Of course it wasn't, and we know that there were huge problems in the fact that Labour, for example, was partly by its own choice excluded from that process, and of course also that the majority of Protestants on the island did not take part in that process for all sorts of reasons. But nevertheless, up to that point, there had never been an assembly, a democratically elected assembly on this island, which had anything like the kind of mandate that this one had. And it's interesting, and I'd like to start by just looking back very briefly on what did those people think they were doing. And they thought they were doing two things, because when they met, they engaged in two pretty simple processes. They passed two sets of documents. One of the things they were interested in, not surprisingly, was sovereignty, was the idea of independence, that Ireland was an independent nation and could function as such in the modern world. And so one of the things they did, of course, when they met was they passed formally the Declaration of Independence. They declared Ireland to be an independent country. And they declared it to be an independent republic. And that's the second bit of it, which I think is important. Now, both of those kind of simple ideas, apparently simple ideas, independent and republic, I would suggest, are really ideas that we have to look at in a very critical way at the moment. Because it is now by no means a rhetorical point to state that an independent nation no longer exists on the island. I know many people in the north would argue that it never did. And of course partition has been a huge limitation on the idea of independence. But I think up to recently, most people in the South would have actually taken it for granted that they lived in a state which at least had the basic minimum of independence. It was capable of functioning as an independent democracy. You could have elections, and the elections would elect governments which had the power to take decisions about the use of public resources, for example, about taxation, about public spending, about borrowing, about all those kind of really basic things that governments do. It was an absolute assumption. Even in the worst times, and God knows most of the times in the South, actually, if you look at it historically, have been pretty poor. That assumption has now been completely blown apart. It is one of the great acts of sort of comic genius to have taken what was one kind of crisis, turned it into another kind of crisis, and then turned it into yet another one. What happened in the South was you started with a banking crisis. By assuming all the banking debt, which they did in September 2008, when they underwrote all the liabilities of all the banks, without knowing what those liabilities were, Fianna Fáil in government and the Green Party managed to make a banking crisis a sovereign debt crisis. Right? So what they did overnight, and I don't think, I've looked, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I've looked and tried to find, I don't think there's any parallel anywhere in the world ever for a country which overnight doubled its national debt. That's what the Republic did in one night. By assuming all the bank liabilities, the entire national debt was doubled. So that turned what was a banking crisis into a sovereign debt crisis. There was no sovereign debt crisis. This was not a crisis of the public sector. It was not a crisis fundamentally of the state. It was a crisis of the private sector. But that private sector crisis was turned into a public crisis by a decision of government which was never debated in Parliament properly, because the decision had been made long before there was any proper consultation. There wasn't even a meeting of the Cabinet to do this. So there wasn't even a meeting of the full Cabinet taking on this responsibility. The single most important decision made in the history of the state. And subsequently, that was bad enough, but subsequently what's happened is, so you've transformed a banking crisis into a sovereign debt crisis. Then that wasn't enough, so they've transformed a sovereign debt crisis into a democratic crisis. So when they entered into the deal with the so-called Troika, which is essentially the European Union and the IMF and the European Central Bank, when they entered into that deal, they effectively turned their sovereign debt crisis into a democratic crisis by a government which had no mandate to do any of this, again, which was never debated before it was done, even in Parliament. They turned all of this into a programme which effectively makes government redundant for a period, in theory, of 4 years, but in fact long beyond that. Right? But it effectively means that you have a 4-year programme under which every single decision is already made about the key things, about taxation, about the disposition of public resources, about the priorities, and about things which, by the way, have nothing whatsoever to do with the sovereign debt crisis. So this was sold to people as being all about, well, we need money, because if we don't get this money, the banks are going to close tomorrow and public servants aren't going to be paid, and panicking people into this. But also included things like, for example, the minimum wage. Now, the only effect of cutting the minimum wage in a society is to actually increase the crisis in public debt. If you decrease the minimum wage, you decrease economic activity, you decrease the amount of taxation you're taking in, and you therefore widen the government debt. But ideologically, the attack on the minimum wage is a key part of the strategy. And you now have, and I know, I'm sure most of you are spared this by living across the border, but if you listen to RTE radio, for example, it is now a kind of commonplace of political discussion. So you get a government minister, including Labour ministers, for example, will go on and say, I'm terribly sorry, we have to close schools for autistic children, but we don't make these decisions anymore. We are not, we don't have economic sovereignty. We can't actually make any kind of choice about this. And fundamentally what you have is you have a very stark illustration of a really profound democratic crisis. Because you had a general election, which in some ways was the most radical general election that's ever taken place in the history of the southern state. The Fianna Fáil, the dominant party, was completely destroyed. And the general election actually made no difference. It made very, very little difference to the fundamental framework of policy. And when that happens, you know you're in very, very deep trouble. And it's that democratic crisis, I think, that it both poses the fundamental challenge we have and perhaps opens up the possibility of new ways of thinking about this idea of a republic and what people might have thought they were doing when they declared one in 1919. It's very striking, if you go back to 1919, that if you look at the documents that were produced then, and we were never taught these in school, by the way. Everybody teaches you or taught us the 1916 proclamation, which is obviously a very significant document, but is largely rhetorical. What they never taught us was a thing called the democratic programme of the first Dáil. The democratic programme was very interesting in that once they had declared an independent republic, they had to say, what does a republic do? Not what is it, but what does it do? And in a sense, we're saying essentially, it is what it does. It's not an abstract concept. It's not about not having a king. It's not about the fact that people get to vote, although those things are important to it. It's actually about what it does. So what does it do? And I just want to quote very briefly from some of the things they thought it did, because I think they are, in our circumstances, again, extraordinarily relevant. First of all, what they said was that the democratic programme, by the way, is 600 words long. It's one of the shortest political documents that's been produced in a country that's famously prolix in terms of using words. 600 words. And in 600 words, it essentially sets down a vision for a very practical notion of what a republic does. First of all, it says, it affirms, and I quote, all right to private property must be subordinated to the public right and welfare. A particularly resonant phrase now that we've completely reversed its meaning. The current situation, and this is not a rhetorical exaggeration, but the current situation is that all public right and welfare must be subordinated to private property. Because essentially what's happening in the South at the moment is that all public resources have effectively been seized. And they have been seized, the control of them has been seized in order to repay private debtors. Effectively the French, German and British banks who lent the money into the Irish system to inflate the bubble. I should just say, because one of the difficulties about this is we were talking about this earlier on, just chatting away, but is the numbers. I think definitely the human brain has some kind of instinctive limit in terms of understanding numbers. Once you go beyond 1 billion, it's just all words. It's just all another couple of zeros. So it's perhaps just worth taking a moment to explain what we're talking about. The sum total of money being put in, of public money being put into the banking system, half of which, by the way, is a dead banking system. It's banks which have ceased to function entirely. So these are not banks which will ever lend a penny to anybody ever again. Anglo-Irish Bank and Irish Nationwide in particular. The sum total, if you count it up, there's 3 bits of it. There's straightforward cash that's been put into them. There's a grotesque creation, a thing called NAMA, which was set up to buy all the bad property investments that the banks made, get them off the bank's books. As a public, it's the biggest property owner in the world. Biggest single property owner in the world is this thing called NAMA, which has paid about 35 billion euro for crap property, basically, that was purchased at insane Celtic Tiger prices. So you've got that as a second part of it. And the third part of it, which people pay no attention to, but the Irish Central Bank is also providing what's called a liquidity for the banks. So they put in the cash as the capital, that's the money they need in order to back their borrowings. But there's the liquidity, which is the money they're supposed to lend out and keep doing their business. Most of that liquidity is provided by public bodies, the European Central Bank, but also the Irish Central Bank. So take the Irish Central Bank part of it. If you add those three things up, it comes to about 105,000 million euro. I'll say that again, right? 105,000 million euro. And because that's sort of incomprehensible, there's a kind of a simple, I'm not terribly good at maths, but the simple enough sum that even I can do, which is how many people are at work in the south? There's 1.8 million people. It's about the same workforce as Greater Manchester. And one way or other, there's 1.8 million people have to assume or fund this banking rescue of 105,000 million euro. It works out, roughly speaking, this is the easy way to understand it, it's about 50 to 55,000 euro for every worker in the state. To my knowledge, again, and I could be wrong, but I've tried to find other examples, I don't think anybody in the history of the world has ever tried to do this before. I don't think there's any parallel for this whatsoever. So you have an extraordinary transfer of resources from citizens to private entities. And remember, the point of all of this is, the only point of it is, to repay the people who lent the money into the Irish banks in the first place. Because the Irish banks were borrowing the money that they were lending out to idiot property developers. And that money was coming, biggest chunk of it was coming from German banks, the second was coming from French banks, and the third biggest chunk was coming from British banks. So the point is that they will get repaid. So that simple thing in the democratic programme about public welfare trumps private property. Maybe we should actually think about going back to that as a basic principle. It then sets down, right, the governing ideals will be liberty, equality, and justice for all. Right? Still not bad, pretty resonant stuff. Particularly stuff about equality. Equality became, during the Celtic Tiger, one of the things that was no longer of any relevance to a republic. To most of us, it might seem pretty obvious that if you start talking about what a republic is, the thing you would start with is equality. Right? It's the idea that a republic is a community of equal citizens. But it's worth remembering that in the self-delusion, the sort of hysterical, hallucinatory stage of the Celtic Tiger, where Ireland had become this model of the great success of neoliberal globalization, one of the things that was dispensable in the ideology was the idea of equality. It no longer mattered at all. And in fact, one of the good things that happens when politicians are on drugs, the drug of self-esteem in this case, they were so arrogant, they actually started sometimes to say what they actually thought, what they actually believed. And one of the things they started saying was, look, you don't really need equality. In fact, inequality might be a necessary condition of prosperity. You know, that if people are unequal, it gives people incentives to go out there and create new wealth. And actually, if you pay too much attention to equality, you're going to hold back this great economic development which we have. And we can come back to some of that delusion. But returning to a notion of equality might be one way of thinking. But then, and I think this is particularly interesting, the democratic programme then goes on, right, and it talks about, okay, what does a republic have to do? What are its duties? Never mind, okay, liberty, equality, justice for all, that's nice stuff, that's mom and apple pie. What does that mean? And it starts with, I think, one of the most radical sentences of its time. Again, I don't know of any political document by a newly elected parliament, a newly elected state. What does it say is the first duty of the new state? Does it talk about defence? Does it talk about, you know, raising the national flag? Does it talk about the Irish language? No. It talks about children. And in a very simple way, it says, it shall be the first duty of the government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children, to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold from lack of food, clothing or shelter. And it then goes on to talk about two other very simple things, which is the treatment of the elderly and a decent health system. And it says, the Irish Republic fully realises the necessity of abolishing the present odious, degrading and foreign poor law system. The poor law system was basically the dreaded system in which elderly people who couldn't support themselves were basically locked away. Substituting, therefore, a sympathetic native scheme for the care of the nation's aged and infirm, who shall not be regarded as a burden, but rather entitled to the nation's gratitude and consideration. Likewise, it shall be the duty of the Republic to take such measures as will safeguard the health of the people and ensure the physical as well as the moral well-being of the nation. Right? So, in a couple of words, it says, I think incredibly movingly, the first thing you've got to do if you're a Republic is look after kids. You know you're not a Republic if you've got starving kids, if you've got kids whose development is being stunted, if you've got kids who are being treated as outsiders into society. And you know you're not a Republic if you're treating elderly people with a lack of dignity, if you're shunting them off into places whereby they're not allowed to be full citizens. And you know you're not a Republic if you don't have a health system which actually places health as a basic right for all citizens. Very, very radical stuff, but also very, very simple stuff. And stuff which was completely written out of the history of the state. So once the Southern state was established, the democratic programme was completely forgotten. It wasn't taught in schools, it wasn't put up in framed and put up in public buildings. It was, and I think Kevin O'Higgins, who was the very conservative Minister for Justice, dismissed it and said it was just poetry. It was just a bit of rhetoric, really. Get over that now. And of course they were right to ignore it because, of course, the reality was a grotesque betrayal of even those three simple things. It is appalling to think that a republic which is supposedly founded on saying the first duty is to children would become a republic which, and again, I'm not being rhetorical about this, but actually enslaved and tortured tens of thousands of children in institutions, and which to this day has never ever adopted a basic decent approach to the human rights of children. And you can still read in my own newspaper during the week lists of children in appalling circumstances who don't even have any basic care from the state. The poor law system. The poor law system was a huge thing for Irish nationalists, by the way. It was really felt by most people in Ireland that one of the things that told you that British rule was corrupt and immoral was the poor law system. The way that elderly people were being treated was degrading. And the Democratic programme used that word, degrading. What did they do when they established the state? They changed the name of the system. So they didn't call it the poor law system anymore, they called it county homes. And the county homes continued right up to the 1970s. Pretty much exactly the same system. And in terms of health, and health being a real kind of test of whether you've got a republic, the South has constructed essentially an apartheid system of healthcare. If the rich were white and the poor were black, it would be a system that would be a major international issue, because effectively your life is valued in one way if you can afford medical treatment, particularly hospital treatment, and it's valued in a very different way if you can't. And again, you might think I'm being rhetorical about this. I'm not at all. I mean, I had very direct personal experience of this, where someone very close to me went to an elderly person went to a consultant. She needed a heart valve. It's a very simple operation, put in a stent. The consultant said basically you could die. This is very serious. You could die of this really. Pretty much any time you just drop dead, but I can't get you into hospital for 6 months. So you just have to hope that you don't drop dead in 6 months. And then she mentioned, well, I've got health insurance. He said, I'm terribly sorry, you can come in tomorrow. I mean, it's literally that's the way it works, you know. And by the way, this is it's relevant to north of the border because this is the way you're going if they get their way. So if you take those basic things, just very, very basic things about what a republic does, I think you can see both that those ideals have been grotesquely betrayed, but also perhaps allows us a very simple way to start rethinking around ideas of what is a republic, how does it function and what are its values. Now, the need to do this, I think, is relatively obvious. I think even if we had not stumbled into an appalling economic crisis, it's been pretty obvious, I think, to people on both sides of the island that to some extent we've lived through a period in which we've had, I think Charlie Haughey called Northern Ireland a failed political entity, but you know, it was pretty much sort of people in glass houses throwing stones. You know, the Republic, so-called, has been a failed political entity. It also has failed to live up to its own most basic perceptions as to what it's supposed to be. But also it has, let's remember, for most of its history, it has been an economic failure. People ask me, why are people not protesting so much in the South in terms of what's going on at the moment? And we can probably talk about this a bit more later on. But one of the reasons, I think, is that people forget that psychologically the status quo has been one of failure. You know, this is a state which has actually economically failed for most of its history. It failed from 1922 up to about 1960 in terms of, you know, the very basic tests of whether it was capable of actually providing any kind of work for the majority of its population. It's an astonishing figure, by the way. In the 1950s alone, 400,000 people emigrated from the South, mostly to Britain. 400,000 people out of a population of a little over 2 million. That's within one decade. You then had a boom in the 1960s. And by the way, the boom of the 1960s was very like the boom of the 1990s. You know, it was fueled by multinational investment. It produced a lot of the same kind of optimism, a lot of the same kind of delusion, a lot of the same kind of rapid rises in house prices, on a certainly a much more small scale, but a lot of the same kind of phenomena happened around it. But the boom of the 1960s was followed by a slump, certainly from the late 1970s onwards, all through the 1980s, and then the economy doesn't pick up again until the mid-1990s, and then you have this boom from roughly about 1995 to 2007. You get 12 years of Celtic Tiger, and now you're into what is being referred to, even in official discourse, as a lost decade. You know, this is what we're talking about, that actually the place is screwed for 10 years. That's the optimist's view. You know. So, by and large, even at the economic level, the state has not functioned well. And I don't need to tell you that there have been certain problems in relation to the Northern Ireland state, running parallel with that. So we have a situation in which neither part of the island has actually functioned particularly well as a state or statelet or whatever you want to call it. And perhaps a lot of people, James Connolly perhaps would have said this is entirely predictable, you know, that if you get partition, you're going to get the carnival of reaction, you're going to get the sectarianism, you're going to get the stunted nature of development in both parts. But whatever about the historical roots of it, it's the reality we have to confront. So even if we hadn't got into this really appalling situation we're in at the moment in the South, we would have to face up to, I would suggest, the need to attempt to rethink the idea of a republic. Not least because the state in the South was essentially a sectarian state. It was less nakedly so than the state in the North, but it was also founded on an idea of identity, which was effectively religious identity. You know, it trumped the idea of citizenship or of republican citizenship with an idea of Catholic identity. And this, I think, also has very severe long-term consequences for the idea of a republic. Classically speaking, one of the things that people thought a republic was about was actually morality. You know, there was a notion of civic morality as being at the heart of a republic, that People have a system of, broadly speaking, a consensus around things that are right and wrong, which is objective and is neutral. It's sort of outside of whether you happen to be Catholic, whether you happen to be Protestant, Jewish, whatever, black, white, male, female, gay, straight. There's a system of public morality which actually is supposed to operate. Now, I'm not suggesting that this has ever actually functioned very well anywhere, but there has been that notion of civic morality. And that never really existed at all in the South. Morality was outsourced to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, as we know, was vastly more interested in what was going on in bedrooms than what was going on in boardrooms. So morality has never had anything to do with tax evasion, has never had anything to do with the kind of extraordinary crookedness that's been evident. Not just recently, by the way. There's a sort of myth that, the Celtic Tiger was this terrible period now when everybody got greedy and lost the run of themselves. This stuff has been going on for decades, absolutely for decades, and nothing has been done about it. There's been a system essentially of public corruption which has allowed all this to happen and which has included, I've always said, by the way, Ireland is not more corrupt than a lot of other societies. The difference is impunity. In most societies, if you're corrupt and you get caught, they make an example of you, at least to pretend that there is a functioning morality there. The distinctive thing about the South has been getting caught makes no difference. In fact, in some cases, getting caught is quite good for you. Again, I was just saying earlier, in 2009, in the local elections, this is 2009, this isn't sort of during the Celtic Tiger madness, 2009, during the local elections, 2 convicted fraudsters got elected to county councils. Now, to understand this, you have to understand that convicted fraudster is pretty much a contradiction in terms in the South. It's really hard to get convicted if you're a fraudster. And actually have been so stupid and so naked as to actually get convicted means you've been pretty bad at the fraud. 2 of them actually got elected to county councils, having defrauded those county councils. Right? It's astonishing. One guy is called Michael Stroke Fahy, and I always thought, well, actually, at least the advertising is honest. That's stroke. I don't know if you have that term, and I know you have a different meaning in Derry, but stroke just means pulling a fast one. It means getting away with a bit of trickery. And Stroke Fahy got more votes after he came out of jail than he got before he went in. So, but my point is essentially that this idea of a republic as something that has a kind of civic morality has been profoundly absent, and that has had huge consequences, huge economic consequences, because it's been at the heart of the way in which the banks were allowed to operate, the way in which the property developers were allowed to operate, and one could also say the way in which the church was allowed to operate. And this remains the case, by the way. It is still the case that impunity has been completely untouched by everything that's happened. It's absolutely extraordinary. Not a single banker has had any action taken against them. There is, in theory, a big criminal investigation going on to Anglo-Irish Bank, but we've been told that nothing will happen until 2012 at the earliest, if it ever happens. 40% of the bank directors, people who were actually directors of the banks at the time that they created this catastrophe, were still in place at the end of last year as directors of those banks, publicly owned banks now. So you have this vacuum of civic morality, which I would suggest, in any case itself would have created the need for rethinking this whole notion of what a republic is. And I just want to really suggest, I think, 2 quite important things in terms of this process of thinking about it. One is, and I think this is absolutely as relevant north of the border as it is south of the border, which is to challenge a particular word that's being used in a very, very meaningful way, I think, politically. And that word is austerity. You're now having austerity budgets. We've had 5 of them, and we are still in very deep trouble, so we're going to have a lot more of them. Austerity is being constructed as an idea And it's been constructed as an idea, as a reaction to the international debt crisis. Right? So the international debt crisis was caused by the private sector, was caused by the deregulation of the banks in a very deliberate way, by the way. You know, it's important to remember that they talk about, wouldn't it have been great if there was some regulation? The fact is, there was regulation, and a lot of it was deliberately just dismantled. You know, in the United States, for example, there was an act which came out of, it was part of the response to the Wall Street crash in the 1920s, and the depression of the 1930s, a thing called the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act was a very, very basic piece of legislation. It basically said a bank can't be involved at the same time in different kinds of activities. So it can't be both involved in, say for example, in insurance and in retail banking, or it can't be involved in retail banking and merchant banking. And the point of this was, you know, you don't want monster banks which actually acquire this vast range of financial services which they're pushing all the time, because they get too big and they get too irresponsible and they're going to crash. Now, that was dismantled. It was dismantled under Bill Clinton, by the way. There was very deliberate, you know, policies of dismantling regulation. But that system of you know, so-called light touch regulation you know, has led to what is a very profound international crisis. And let's call it what it is, because people are still afraid to use the word, but it's a crisis of capitalism, you know, rather obviously. At the very least, one can say, is that the version of capitalism which has become the entirely dominant one since Reagan and Thatcher in 1979, 1980, that model of capitalism is in absolutely profound crisis. And it's in a crisis that it's not going to get out of quickly. What we've been sold, however, is the idea that, look, essentially the mentality is this is a short-term crisis. There's a problem. There's a liquidity problem. There's a problem of debt. There's a problem of fear. The markets are nervous. And therefore, by the way, you know, all of us, we're responsible. We have built up too much debt. And therefore, the solution to this is essentially austerity, which is you cut, and you balance the books. And that way, the markets will start loving us all again and everything will be fine. And this is the fairy tale that we're being told. Now, at the heart of this fairy tale is this notion of austerity. And I think it's worth just pausing a moment over the root of the notion of austerity politically and challenging even the way in which this word is being used. Austerity is currently being used as a synonym for cuts, and in particular as a synonym for cuts that affect the most vulnerable and the weakest first and most. You look at the patterns, and again, this is very relevant to people north of the border from the experience of what's happened south of the border. I mean, you already know this, but if you wanted to have it proved, just look at what's happened in the south, right? You have a crisis which was effectively caused by the appalling recklessness and amorality of the elite, of the very wealthy. You had a crisis which was fed by grotesque inequality. This elite was created, and it has been created to a very large extent over the last 20 years. Throughout the Western world, and particularly in the so-called Anglo-Saxon economies, Britain, Ireland, the United States, Australia, Canada, to a lesser extent actually, you have had a very, very deliberate policy of, once you get rid of the notion of equality, which is at the heart of an idea of a republic, what you get is, and what you've had is, a very deliberate redistribution of wealth. So broadly speaking, if you look at the pattern in the Western world from the end of the Second World War up to about 1980, what you find is, and again, there's obviously ups and downs in this, and slightly different in different countries, but broadly speaking, the pattern in the developed world is a narrowing of inequalities. So the gap between the average worker and the chief executive or the senior shareholder is narrowing all the time, over time. And it's astonishing, actually. It's really interesting to read back. If you look back into even the 1960s, even conservative economists and commentators absolutely assume that this is going to continue. They assume the modern world, the natural way things are going to go is that people are going to get more equal. And the Reagan-Thatcher revolution was all about, challenging that essential assumption and saying, no, there was nothing wrong with inequality. In fact, it's a necessary condition for growth and for wealth. Now, what happened with that was a huge redistribution of growth. So broadly speaking, what you've had, the States is the classic example of this. What you've had in the States, even over the last 15 years, you've got the incomes of the top 1% rose by 18%. And the incomes of the average industrial worker fell by 12% in real terms, right? So you've had a massive widening of the gap. In the Republic, you had a very extreme example of this, right? So there was massive economic growth, huge economic growth. Economic growth was genuine, by the way. It really was huge economic growth happening. And not just in terms of the property bubble and all that. I mean, Irish exports doubled in 10 years. That's an enormous amount of new wealth. And of course, everybody gets something out of that. That's what Bertie Ahern was for, is making sure that everybody gets a little bit of something. But overwhelmingly, the new growth was concentrated on the very wealthy. So you ended up with, at the height of the Celtic Tiger, the top 1% of the population had 30% of the wealth. And even within that, you even had enormous gaps between the top 1% and the rest of the top 10%, and then huge gaps between the top 10% and everybody else. So you had very, very stratified society. And this is a very deliberately constructed system. And its ideology, of course, the two great sides of this formula that were guaranteed to work, and of which Southern Ireland was the great exemplar internationally, right? Was do what Ireland has done. And what have they done? Low taxes and light regulation, both of which are, of course, geared towards benefiting the very wealthy. The low taxes, again, the middle classes get a little bit of this, but of course, the more you're earning, the more you benefit from low taxation rates. It's very significant cuts in the rates of taxation. And light regulation, which basically means that you can do what you like with the money. You can shift it around, you can invest it in any kind of way that you want, with the obvious outcomes that we've seen. So that formula, that form of neoliberalism, of which the Republic of Ireland was the sort of great exemplar, has failed, and has failed catastrophically, and is going to go on failing. This isn't a temporary crisis. When you're seeing, even in the United States now, you're seeing a recent report by the mayors of American cities talking about, very large numbers of major American cities which will not recover. And they're talking, this is themselves talking about 2019, 2020, before they recover to where they were, never mind economic growth, but actually get back to where they were in 2007, 2008. Mass unemployment, enormous structural problems in the American economy. You're seeing the crisis in the Eurozone. This isn't any longer, there was an attempt to say that this was a problem of the peripheral countries. It was a problem of the pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. It's now very obvious that it's a fundamental crisis of that model of global neoliberalism. Now, this is where the notion of austerity, I think, needs to be looked at again. Where did the word austerity come from in terms of its use politically, and in terms of austerity as a political program? Well, actually where it came from was something very different from the idea that the solution to economic problems is to cut public services, is to make more people unemployed, is to shrink the state. Austerity actually came from a very fundamental expansion of the state, and the most rapid period of the expansion of the state in human history. Thank you very much. Nice austere glass of water, thank you. The idea of austerity actually started out as an ethical idea. It didn't start out as another word for cuts. Austerity really is a set of ideas, a set of approaches that came out of a period of enormous crisis in Western Europe. Let's think our way back for a moment to 1945, the end of the Second World War. You have a literally devastated continent. You have not a single bridge in France between Paris and the Seine is standing. You have, railway systems, ports, roads, housing, cities completely devastated. You have people, desperate to get enough to eat. You have shortages of everything from soap to beer. You have genuine poverty and genuine lack of basic resources for people. Austerity as an idea comes out of that, which is, right, if everybody is suffering, if we have a situation where things are really bad, how do you need to respond to that? And you respond with, there was an idea of austerity as an ethic, right, which is what you don't do is you don't have wasteful use of your resources. You try to ensure and you try to construct systems so that everybody has enough. Austerity, in a way, was another word for enough. And enough meaning, having a kind of a double meaning in a way. Enough in the sense that, enough is a sort of basic concept around human dignity, which is that there's a level of resources, there's a level of provision that everybody in society needs in order to be a citizen, in order to have the dignity of citizenship in a republic or in a state that they control. They have to have enough. But also the other side of that was, well, enough is enough, actually. If you have enough, then people don't necessarily need a lot more than that. And this is where notions of equality were actually very central to that idea of austerity. Now, let's remind ourselves that out of that period of absolute despair, of massive economic, huge destruction of infrastructure, of jobs, of housing, of cities, of everything else, Western Europe particularly managed to build systems which created the greatest amount of progress for ordinary people in the history of the world. That's the period, really, between 1945 and the 1970s, when more ordinary people, so-called ordinary people, get to school, get public health services, get to universities, begin to get some kind of basic rights in terms of the workplace, when children begin to be valued to an increasing degree in terms of childcare. When you look across those kinds of basic values that we go back to with the 1919 Declaration, the basic stuff around children, around old people, around health, and around education, that's the period in which those things actually make enormous progress for the vast majority of people. And some of you in the room are fortunate enough to be of my age. It's the only reason I'm standing here is because a political decision was made very, very late in the South, by the way, to have free second-level education. In 1968, we did it. I think you were somewhat ahead of the posse in relation to that north of the border. But those decisions were made, and those decisions had enormous impacts on the ordinary lives of millions and millions and millions of people. They gave them prospects that they never possibly would have had before. Now, how is that enormous period of prosperity and of progress possible? It was possible because there was a concentration on basics. That's what austerity meant. Austerity meant actually concentrating on the important things for most people. And saying that actually, you know what, if you're very wealthy and you've got to pay 65% tax in order to fund this, it's worth it. If you are going to live in a society which is going to be sustainable and which is going to have basic levels of decency, then there is a project there which is available to people and which actually can animate people. Now, again, I'm not being romantic about this and suggesting that all of this was done in a perfect way everywhere and that everybody lived in paradise whereby poverty was eliminated, inequality was eliminated. But there was a very profound sense that the direction in which societies were going was towards the elimination of poverty, was towards the elimination of inequalities, was towards getting to points at which there were floors below which nobody should fall. It didn't necessarily mean that everybody was going to be exactly equal in terms of income. It did mean that there was a basic equality which allowed people to function as citizens. So that may seem rather simplistic, but I think it's really important to remind ourselves in a time when we're being panicked into a sense that, look, all of this stuff you got out of the post-war settlements, we can't afford it anymore, and we have to have so-called austerity. We have to challenge that in a fundamental way. Why could we afford it in 1945? Why could we afford it in 1950? And you can't afford it in the conditions of vastly greater prosperity that we exist in today. The levels of wealth creation are vastly higher now. The levels of world trade. The increase in world trade during the 1990s was greater than the increase in world trade from the beginning of time up to 1990, because of globalization. You've had vast increases in the generation of wealth. And it is simply not true to say that our societies are poorer than they were in 1945 and are incapable of coalescing again around those basic ideas of what citizenship means in a republic in terms of how it should be defined and how it should be provided. So how do we imagine ourselves arguing for this? It seems to me that you go back to the very basics and not allow ourselves to be stampeded into panic around all of these things. The basics, I would suggest, are 5 things, and I'll finish on these and open it up. It seems to me the first thing that is central to the idea of a republic in the 21st century on this island is security. I think there's been a fundamental shift in human culture over the last 10 years. We were told that the great value was risk, was that, it's out there, it's all to do with taking the gamble, there'll be winners and losers, risk everything and you will succeed. In fact, the basic human value is security. Most people want to feel a basic sense of security. They want to feel that that there are levels below which they won't fall. And security, I would suggest, is not an abstract concept. There's 2 very simple things around security. One is housing, the provision of public housing, and the other is pensions. Both of these are eminently soluble problems. The Republic, if it's nothing else, I beg your pardon, the South, I shouldn't call it the Republic, is a classic example of how not to do housing policy. If the private sector was going to solve housing problems on its own, if turning housing into a commodity, a market commodity, was going to solve housing problems on its own, then the Republic would be paradise. In fact, the grotesque irony was you've got roughly 250,000 empty houses left in the South after the Celtic Tiger, and at the height of the Celtic Tiger, you had roughly 250,000 people without housing. The housing that was being provided was not being provided as a social need in order to meet one of the basic things that people need in society. And it's a classic example of the abandonment of a basic value. Now, again, I'm sure, like a lot of you, I grew up in public housing in Dublin. It wasn't great. It was 2 bedrooms, overcrowded, not particularly well built, not particularly well designed. But decent communities came out of those places. Compared to what people had before, there was a definite sense of improvement. And there was a sense that, that this was giving people some kind of a very basic security. The same kind of illusion is being peddled to us in relation to pensions, for example. We're being told now, look, we're living too long. This is our fault now again. People are living too long, and therefore pensions are, there's a huge panic being built up around the demographic time bomb of pensions. And we don't have time to go into that in any great detail, but a lot of it is pure panic. And a lot of it is aimed purely at forcing people into a private pensions industry, which is one of the great rip-offs of our time. You know, nobody can tell you what the fees private pensions industry take are. They do not disclose their fees. In general, they're believed to be 2% of the entire pension fund. Now, 2% of a pension fund is absolutely enormous. There's vast amounts of money being made in this. But people are being driven into this, and they're being driven into it in a way which goes completely against the idea of security. So what happens to the money that you're supposed to invest? It's to be invested in stock markets. The same wonderfully stable stock markets that never go down that we're seeing at the moment. You know, feeding into exactly the same sense of insecurity that's being created for people. Again, let's remind ourselves of a very simple thing. The single biggest contribution to human welfare, certainly in these islands, and I would suggest probably around the world, has been the public pension system, the old age pension. It's absolutely fascinating. If you look, the All Ireland census, 1911 census, is online now from the public archives in Dublin, and you can look it up. It's very good to look at because it's cross-border, it covers the entire country. One of the things that's fascinating about they have the 1901 census and the 1911 census. An awful lot of people age more than 10 years between 1901 and 1911. The reason is the old age pension was introduced in the meantime. And so older people who were desperate to say, no, I'm not old, because that was stigma and you were likely, to be turfed out on the road or into the poorhouse, were now saying, yeah, I'm old, I'm over 65. And the pension actually made an enormous difference to people. And, public pension systems have actually worked. They've worked in enormous ways. They've lifted tens of thousands of, millions and millions of people out of poverty across the developed world. The defence of those systems has now been made into, we're being told that this is something which is fundamentally unreal and irresponsible, and that the future lies in private pension provision. The opposite is the case. The defence of public pensions, and I would suggest the expansion of public pensions, would be one of the key things you would do in a republic. And again, going back to the 1919 Declaration, the equivalent now of the idea of poor law and of the treatment of elderly people would be found in the defence of the public pension system. Very simply, I'm not entirely au fait with the situation north of the border, but south of the border, the state spends as much on subventing private pensions, mostly for the very wealthy, as it does on the public pension system. It would seem to me that if you really want to have austerity, let's say take all the money, double the public pension, and let everybody have the public pension and give people at least a basic level of security in their old age. That's one thing you can do that makes an enormous difference to people. Second thing you can do is you can have health systems, and it is perfectly possible to come up with health systems which abolish apartheid between those who can pay and those who can't pay. If you could only do that by, say, 2016, you might, after all, think that you could have at least some degree of pride in celebrating 1916. You could say, actually, there was something we did as a republic. The third thing is education and children. Going back to, again, the 1919 Declaration. We know, and it's been shown time and time and time again, that the best single investment you can make, this is just economically, by the way, leaving aside all the huge issues of social justice and of equality and of simple human decency, the best economic investment you can make is in early childhood education. Study after study after study after study has shown. The figures range from every dollar, mostly in the States, every dollar you put in produces $7 later on. And more recent studies say the figure is actually 11. For every dollar, every euro, every pound you put in, you're going to get 11 back. Purely on an economic basis in terms of investment. Now, if you were to put that the other way around, if you were to say, actually, there's an industry that the state can invest in, or there's a company we can invest in, or there's an infrastructural project you can invest in that will have those kinds of returns, you can be pretty sure that the stock markets would be rushing into them. Yet we know that this is the case. We know that actually investing in children has enormous medium-term and long-term payback. Never mind the fact that it's also the very definition of a republic. It's actually one of the ways in which you can say, well, we must be living in a republic because children are given a chance. And those children who are coming from the most vulnerable, the most deprived backgrounds are given the most support to try to get them up to a level whereby they can participate in the society. The fourth thing you can look at is equality itself. It seems to me that people will put up with an awful lot, including difficult economic times, if they have a sense of genuine equality. One of the things that makes the current situation so absolutely galling for people is not just the sense that things are tough, it's the sense that the majority of people are being taken advantage of in order to preserve the position of the elites that created the problem in the first place. The fundamental injustice that's at the basis of that is absolutely corrosive for a society. There's a very interesting psychological experiment that's been done in lots of different societies. So it's been reproduced under experimental conditions in lots of different places. It's very, very interesting. What they do is you take two people and you have the third person who's doing the experiment, right? And the third person who's doing the experiment says, okay, they have an amount of money. Say it's 100 quid. And they explain to the two people the rules, very simple rules of this game, right? Which is, you give one person 100 quid and you say, you've got to share that 100 quid with the other person. You get one chance, you make an offer of a certain amount of that money. If they accept the offer, you both get to keep whatever you're given. If they don't accept the offer, I take the money back. A simple experiment, right? Simple rule. So you've got the 100 quid. I say to you, okay, I'm going to give you 20 quid. Now, the logic of this game is, right, the person who doesn't have the money, who's being made the offer, should accept whatever they're offered, right? Because otherwise they're going to get nothing anyway. So if somebody says, here's 100 quid, I'm going to give you 2 quid. You should say, well, 2 quid's better than nothing. I may as well walk away with it. Overwhelmingly, and very interesting, this experiment has been done in very poor societies, right, where this money means a lot. So the money might be as much as a month's salary for somebody, like 150 quid, 200 quid. That's a lot of money. It's been done in Indonesia, some African societies, for example, as well. There's a lot of money. Overwhelmingly, people will not accept an unfair offer. They will walk away. They will actually say, you know what, up yours. I'm not taking it. Because they'll at least get the satisfaction of knowing the other bastard doesn't get the money either. And this has been reproduced again and again and again, right? Now, if you think about this, that's exactly, they call it the ultimatum game. And it has been done, it's very scientifically done, right? So this isn't just a myth, it's actually been done a lot. Almost nobody will accept less than 30%. So for less than 30 quid of the 100 quid, people will walk away. But also, what they find is that by and large, very few people will offer less than 30%. Because they feel, actually, it's kind of wrong, it's a bit shitty, Actually, most people have, in spite of everything we're told all the time, people's basic instincts are towards a certain kind of decency and a certain kind of fairness. And when you grotesquely distort that sense of decency by saying, you know what, we're going to take all your money for the next 10 years to pay off German banks, it's not just about the money, it's also fundamentally about that basic social contract, that basic sense of decency, that basic sense of fairness that operates. Now, I don't believe that the vast majority of our societies can get away over the next 10 years without difficulty. There is no magical solution. Enormous problems have been created within our societies, within our economies, by this failed experiment of global neoliberalism. So it's going to be tough, and very difficult choices are going to have to be made. But we know from the way in which people react that if you can put a genuine sense of fairness at the centre of that system of making choices, then actually not only will you get better choices because you'll have a more rational way of trying to do this, but you will also get a much better chance that actually you can preserve some kind of social consensus out of this. The way this is being gone about at the moment, which is, line up all the soft targets first, make sure that the people who need to be protected, who are the wealthy, are entirely protected. The way they're going about that, I would suggest, is not simply immoral and unjust, but is also unsustainable. I think it will, over time, create very nasty reactions, not all of which will be progressive reactions. We know that people will react in ways which they start looking for scapegoats, they start looking for somebody else to blame. There's nasty stuff out there. So there's a period in which there's the opportunity is there to reorient this stuff. And if we don't take that opportunity, I think we could be in deep trouble. And the last of the 5 basic values I would suggest that we can put at the centre of this is democracy. We face already in the South the implosion of our democracy. And I think you will increasingly face it north of the border as well. You may have more politicians per head of population than anywhere else in the world. You may have systems of democracy. But increasingly what you will find is you're getting a kind of mini version of what we're getting. We're getting, actually, you know what, there's nothing we can do about it because it's already been decided in Brussels and Frankfurt. You're getting, and you will be getting increasingly, your own politicians, whatever their intention, saying to you, look, we're terribly sorry, there's nothing much we can do about it, it's already been decided in London. The strictures which are being placed through this notion of austerity are having a fundamental effect in terms of people's sense of having any kind of control, any kind of choice about the things that affect their lives in a fundamental way. And therefore, at the heart of the idea of trying to recreate a republic, or perhaps recreate is the wrong word because we haven't really had one ever, it is an absolute urgent need for a renewal of the idea of democracy. We actually have to rethink what democracy means in the 21st century. And we're not alone in this. There's a democratic crisis, really, which I would suggest is pretty much universal at the moment. It's particularly stark in the 26 counties at the moment because it's very naked. But the underlying sense that people have actually lost any sense of control over their own lives, I think is very potent. And the dilemma we have is that who can renew the democracy? Are the people who are most invested in it, who are already in position, are they the ones who are going to recreate the democracy? Rather unlikely, I think. Pressure can certainly be put on them. There certainly are progressive forces out there, but it's going to have to be rebuilt from the bottom up, I think. And it's going to have to be rebuilt by new forms of engagement, new forms of people actually attempting to take control over their own lives and doing it from the bottom up. There's no better place to make this point than here. It is really moving to be standing in a place which is the product of community engagement. And it's very striking in Derry that it is difficult times. It's times of crisis. It's times when people have had to go through enormous amounts of suffering that have actually produced a level of community engagement that can produce a wonderful facility like this and produce all the things that it represents, like this Féile, like the extent to which people are engaged. But unless we get that kind of engagement redoubled in every community in the country over a very long period of time in a sustained way, we don't really have the opportunity to take back our democracy. But if we do, if we begin this process and if we start to think about those very practical values around which we organise, which I think are those values that were articulated so strongly in 1919, then there actually is a prospect that instead of commemorating a centenary as something to do with the past, we might actually believe that it's something to do with our future as well. Thank you very much.